Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I want to extend my thanks to Superintendent David Brown and his leadership team who are joining us this morning, as well as Police Board President Guillen Foreman and Chairman of the City Council Public Safety Committee, Alderman Chris Taliaferro. As many of you know, 2 months ago, our city bore witness to a video that left us all shaken and enraged. We all now know and saw a police raid at the home of Miss Anjanette Young, whose personal dignity was abused and violated when a search warrant was executed at her home, which happened to be the exact wrong address. What Miss Young experienced continues to be traumatic and disturbing for all Chicagoans of goodwill, but especially for Black folks and people of color here in Chicago and really across the country. That video resonated wide and far. Because what people saw was something that too many people of color and Black folks have experienced way too often, and a reality that is too present. An overall lack of regard and respect. That moment served as an abrupt but appropriate wake-up call to our entire city. And even though that February 2019 raid occurred before I was mayor and before Superintendent Brown was in charge of the Chicago Police Department, we have owned and we have a responsibility to make right what was wrong. It was a clarion call for us to look at what happened and what we needed to do to make sure that the circumstances that Ms. Young endured were never repeated again, and to do everything possible to make sure that that didn't happen. That is why today I'm proud to join my fellow leaders here in announcing sweeping new changes to the Chicago Police Department's search warrant policy. And I will call them draft changes because we will put them out for public comment and review. They will be posted and a detailed and comprehensive and above all transparent process will ensue and build upon ongoing reform efforts to ensure that the values of transparency, accountability, and fundamental respect for human dignity are reflected whenever a search warrant is issued and served. And this includes the following steps and changes. To that end, we are announcing today the next steps, and I will break these up into what happens before a search warrant is executed, during, and after. Before a search warrant is executed, here's some of the new changes that are reflected. All warrants must now be approved by a deputy chief or above. That is 3 ranks higher than the current requirement that all warrants be approved by a lieutenant or above. Now, submitting officers' chain of command, including their commander, will review the search warrant before it ever gets to the deputy chief for approval. Why is this necessary? It's necessary because, as we all know, going into somebody's home should be an exception. A Fourth Amendment allows for that to happen, but only in certain circumstances where there's an establishment that evidence of a crime will be found in a particular location. No matter how you slice it, it is an intrusion. And so making sure that we get the facts and the details right and that there is ownership at the highest levels of CPD is critically important. This new policy also addresses no-knock warrants. Now, to be clear, in CPD, no-knock warrants are extraordinarily rare. But what this new policy does is formalizes the exacting standards under which no-knock warrants will be permitted, and making sure, in fact, that they are very rare circumstances and only used when there is clear evidence of danger to someone's life or safety. That is the appropriate high standard that must be met. And furthermore, all no-knock search warrants must be personally reviewed by a bureau chief, not a designee. And to make this point very clear, there are only a small handful of chiefs within CPD. So we are elevating this circumstance of a potential no-knock warrant even higher within CPD, and making sure that the chief and no designee, just the chief, owns responsibility for any no-knock warrant that is signed off on. There's also new provisions to protect vulnerable persons, including children. We are now requiring a planning session before the warrants are served to identify any potential vulnerable people present at the location. And finally, we previously required an independent investigation to verify and corroborate John Doe search warrants, that is, warrants that do not contain a specific person's name. Now, all search warrants will require an independent investigation to verify and corroborate information used to develop the warrants. This will help make sure that the information being relied upon is accurate and verified. And these are just some of the new pre-execution safeguards that must be followed before a search warrant can ever be presented to the state's attorney or to a court. I now want to turn to what happens during the warrants. And I want to reflect upon one of the, I think, the most important changes in this new policy, and that is emphasizing that no matter what the circumstances, any individuals found within a location where a search warrant is executed must be treated with dignity and respect. And let me read the actual language that is now the first policy prescription in the new draft search warrant policy. All department members will treat all persons with courtesy and dignity, which is inherently due every person, and will act, speak, and conduct themselves in a courteous, respectful, and professional manner. And then it goes on from there. This is common sense, but this is now enshrined in the actual policy itself, and I think that that is an important development, so all officers are clear, no matter what the circumstances are, no matter who the target of the investigation is, that person and anyone found within the location must be treated with dignity and respect, period. In addition, when it comes to other reforms during the search warrant itself, the new policy requires a lieutenant be on the scene and have overall command of the search warrant. We will also be requiring a female officer to be present and available for any search team assignment. And only members of CPD SWAT will be able to serve no-knock warrants, which again will only be allowed when there is clear evidence that a life or safety is at risk. Furthermore, each officer participating in serving any search warrant must have and activate body-worn cameras. And the Chicago Police Department will be adding specific rules related to pointing of weapons at people while serving a search warrant. Let's now turn to what this new warrant policy affects in the after the warrant is executed. CPD took a hard look at its policies and procedures after the warrant was served. And notably, CPD is establishing the specific status of a wrong raid. Wrong raids will now encompass any time in which the warrant is served either at the wrong address or as the circumstances with Ms. Young, the warrant, in fact, the facts underlying the warrant are inconsistent with the probable cause used to obtain the warrant. So in other words, it is in the circumstances where you get to a location, you execute the warrant, and it's clear that the underlying facts are radically different than what the officers are observing. That's a wrong raid, and here's what happens in that circumstance. It is mandatory that that be reported to the supervisor, and the supervisor now must open up an investigation for CPD to evaluate what happened in the wrong raid. That is crystal clear in the new policy. Wrong raids will also require a critical incident after action review, making sure that the CPD is properly investigating and learning from these incidents. We'll also require CPD to report the actual fact of a wrong raid to the judge with the return of the search warrant. That's another safeguard that I believe personally is critically important, that the judge be notified that there was a wrong raid. These are the highlights of the changes that are going to now be instituted in this new search warrant policy. Each of these reforms was crafted for the sole purpose of ensuring that the rights and the basic human dignity of all Chicagoans, no matter what the circumstances, are respected and protected, and that the wrongs of the past are made right. This moment, however, is not the end, it's the beginning. And I also want to emphasize that 2 weeks ago, I signed an executive order that requires that when a victim of a police incident comes forward, particularly circumstances like Ms. Young, that that person must be given video, police reports, audio of any incident where they believe that they have been harmed by the Chicago Police Department. That is critically important. One of the big lessons learned from the circumstances of Ms. Young and other wrong raids is that people who believe that they were victimized shouldn't have to jump through lots of different hoops and hire a lawyer in order to get access to information about what happened to them. This is now the decreed from my office to CPD, to COPA, and any other investigative body that has access to information that could help a victim who alleges that they've been mistreated at the hands of the Chicago Police Department. Now, I want to close by saying this. We have all made a commitment to continue to engage in these difficult conversations about the harms that have been created and how we build a better path forward, whether it's within our police department or the broader issues that are resonating within our city. This has been a very tough year for our city and our residents. Whether it's COVID-19, whether it's the civic uprising that followed the murder of George Floyd, or on and on, all of us are bearing a significant burden as a result of the circumstances over the last year. We've got to be united in finding solutions that bring us together and that unite us and not further divide us. And it's my hope that with this announcement today and others to come, that we are on a path towards healing, which is critically important in this time. And now I'd like to welcome Superintendent Brown to the podium to say a few words. Superintendent?
Thanks, Mayor. Good morning. Thank you, Mayor. Let me start by just reemphasizing some of the things the Mayor just expressed. Number one, the work of the Chicago Police Department should reflect the values of the people who live in this great city. That's why we ordered this top to bottom review of the department's search warrant policy, even though there had been a review in January 2020. Today, CPD makes good on its promise to change how search warrants are served in Chicago. It's always the right time to do the right thing. We should always be evolving to improve our policies, training, and accountability. The new search warrant policy is out for public comment for the next 15 days, as the Mayor mentioned. The latest policy changes were the result of a dedicated work done by a committee headed by Chief of Patrol Brian McDermott. But Chief McDermott did not work alone. The policy was crafted with feedback from our community partners and neighborhood stakeholders. I also want to acknowledge the Chicago City Council for its interest and input in these revisions. The new search warrant policy builds upon the changes, as I mentioned, the CPD instituted in January of 2020. A strong police department must continue to evolve in this way. We must always work to improve. We must always focus special emphasis on continually improving our policies, training, transparency, and accountability. I encourage everyone over the next 15 days to take a look at the new policy and weigh in with your thoughts and opinions. Your comments and recommendations will influence the final product. Once approved, the final policy will be explained in a department training video and will be reinforced with officers with citywide roll calls and training. As a courtesy, we have also shared this new policy with the independent monitor who is overseeing the consent decree. As for the new policy, additional supervision stands out, as the Mayor went through earlier, as a major improvement. Search warrants will now be approved by the very highest ranks of the command staff, with the rank of deputy chief or above, but in the circumstance of no knock, bureau chief or above. A lieutenant instead of a sergeant would now be required to be on scene throughout the search warrant and responsible for the behavior of officers on that scene. And all officers serving a search warrant will be required to wear and activate their body-worn camera. The new policy also requires, as the mayor mentioned, a female officer to be present for all search warrants. As mentioned also, no-knock warrants will be restricted to SWAT officers serving those warrants only in the circumstance of life safety. If police serve a warrant at the wrong address or based on inaccurate information, a complaint log will be numbered and will immediately be generated. CPD would then conduct an after-action review on any wrong raised to identify and remedy mistakes immediately. As police officers, we need to be the first to admit our mistakes and what we can do to make sure we learn from those mistakes. This new policy is a direct reflection of lessons learned. The department remains dedicated to continuous improvement, and we will do so in partnership with the people of Chicago. I want to close with condolences to Officer Daly, who we lost tragically in the last several days. To him and his family, we want to offer our prayers and support. I also want to mention the federal charges of inciting a riot being filed against Massey from the August second round of looting in Chicago. I think that's a significant example of the dedication, hard work, and really very good detective work from Detective Chief of Detective Dina Hand's staff, who relentlessly pursued from a social media Facebook post, collected enough evidence, wouldn't be turned away from getting the charges that we feel are appropriate for the circumstances, Mr. Massey, who has admitted to his crime. Carjacking, reducing violence, officer wellness, improving community trust, consent decree requirements, reform, and changing the culture of the Chicago Police Department is our focus. And the search warrant policy is just one example of continually improving, looking at our policies, being honest and transparent when we make mistakes, and taking the hard steps to be honest with ourselves, to improve and to continually improve. The people of Chicago deserve this, and we are committed to it. Thank you so much. Alderman.
Thank you, Mayor Lightfoot, Superintendent David Brown. Good morning. Let me thank you, Superintendent Mayor, for your continued leadership, especially in your commitment to reshaping the future of the Chicago Police Department. That includes a future, in my perspective, that does not necessarily rely on public polls to determine whether residents of this city feel safe, or to determine whether there's trust between our community and our police. That also includes a future where I believe that policies such as the ones that are being announced today are done on an ongoing basis. You know, there's a saying that I learned when I was a kid, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think you could also say, if something is broken, you must fix it. Now, I'm not saying that our Chicago Police Department is broken, but I do believe that there are some things that we need to tweak and that we need to fix within our department. And these policies that the mayor's announced in an executive orders that the mayor's announcing, will help to guide our police department on a path where our residents do feel safe and our residents do trust, not only in this police department, but they trust in the officers that serve the city. Less than a year ago today, I believe it was this month, where Ms. Breonna Taylor was tragically killed during the execution of a warrant in her home, in her apartment, in her bed. And it was less than a year where the tragic video of Ms. Anjanette Young surfaced. that really showed us where we need to change and where we need to go as a police department. So these reforms that the mayor's announcing today will help bring about true accountability, true responsibility. And I thank you for that. Thank you, and I hope that as the superintendent said, I hope each and every one of you can take an opportunity and weigh in on what you like to see within our policies in our Chicago Police Department. I'd like to introduce Guillen Foreman, the president of the Chicago Police Board. Thank you.
Good morning. Buenos dias. Alderman, I too would like to commend Mayor Lightfoot and Superintendent Brown for these changes, these recommended changes to the search warrant policy. I do believe that this is a great step in the transparency policies that CPD is going about installing. But the changes don't stop with CPD making a recommendation. It really is incumbent upon all members of the public to weigh in. This is how we do, Superintendent, achieve that continuous improvement that we're all seeking when we're talking about making the city better for all. It's very important. These comments are not taken lightly when these comments are put out, and so the same way that we receive comments at the police board, we feel it's very important that we get comments on these kinds of policies and that it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop with a policy change. We would like to ensure that we continuously get feedback from the public, but it starts with this first comment period. It's a short period of time, 15 days, and so encourage your friends. Let's use social media not just for passing around jokes and having a good time. Let's use this to improve our city. So thank you very much.
I'm not sure. This is like old times. I'm not sure who's starting, but I'm happy to take your question. Greg, okay.
We'll open it up to you.
Okay.
Well, good morning, Mayor.
Good morning.
This is from France. Actually, quick brass tacks question. When would they go into effect? So it's these.
Yeah, we'll have the comment period, and then based upon the comments, if there are more changes that need to be made, but obviously there's a sense of urgency around making sure that they go into effect as quickly as possible.
What's the timetable? End of March, April?
Well, like I said, there's going to be a 15-day comment period, and then depending upon the feedback that's given, that feedback will obviously be looked at and taken into consideration real time, but we want to make sure, I would hope that we go into effect certainly by the end of the month.
From Fran Spielman at the Sun-Times, you have acknowledged that public trust in you has been lost by your changing story about what you knew when, and when you knew it about the botched raid on Anjanette Young's home. What will it take for you to regain that trust? Will these changes do it, or do you have more work to do?
Well, I don't really think that's actually what I said. But obviously, the fact of the matter is that trust was no question shaken. And I've been working diligently personally, as has my team, as has the police department, to make sure that we're being responsive to Ms. Young in particular, but also in general to the feedback that we received from many quarters about the experiences that residents were having with Chicago police officers, certainly with respect to search warrants, but beyond that. And we know that trust is not something that is a static thing. It has to be constantly worked upon, and you have to make sure that you're committing yourself, but fundamentally to being present and to listen and to making sure that you're being responsive to the feedback. So it's an ongoing process, I think, that any leader has, and me in particular. So that will be something that we continue to work on.
From Heather Sharon at WTTW, she wants to know what's the status of the Jones Day investigation, which is the investigation you asked for, and I would add what's going on with COPA's investigation as well as the IG's investigation. Do you know when they're going to be done?
So let me take those one at a time. The Jones Day investigation is ongoing. You ask about the IG's investigation. I don't have any insights into that, so you have to refer those questions to the IG. Obviously, the IG started an investigation in July of 2019. So my question is, where have they been for now almost a year and a half? I think that that's a critical question that we have to understand. And the same question regarding COPA. They opened up their investigation regarding Ms. Young's case in November of 19. It's now March of 2021. I've been an investigator, and I know that sometimes things are difficult and complicated, but I can't see any reason why, particularly with respect to Ms. Young's case, that we're in March of 2021, an investigation was opened up in July, and then another one in November of 2019, almost 2 years ago, and we don't have a conclusion of either of them. I don't think that that's helpful to build trust and add legitimacy to either the IG's work or COPA's work. So I'd urge them to be responsive and get the work done.
This question is for Superintendent Brown from Jim Daly at Southside Weekly. He says that 5 of the officers on the Young raid got overtime for that night, but only 2 noted it was for serving a warrant. 3 of them used the generic extension of tour classification. The Inspector General has noted that the generic category codes are an issue with CPD overtime and that that's a problem. Should the department require all overtime requests for serving warrants to be categorized as such?
As part of the review of the search warrant policy, we are addressing some of the things that are, in my opinion, other issues that's related, not necessarily to search warrants, but how officers capture overtime, regardless of the designation. When I started 10 months ago, that's one of the first things that were prominent to me is how do we get control of and be good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars in overtime. So we'll be addressing that with basically looking at the approval levels for overtime. I think to raise the level of approval for any and all of our issues that we might have, whether they're mistakes or just improvements we want to make, really moves the needle much more than keeping these decisions of approval at the lower levels. And so that's one of the things that we implemented last year. We'll build on that this year.
I have a couple off topics, but let's keep it up to the rest in the room before we move to off topics.
For the superintendent or the mayor, can you discuss who under the current search policy? Yeah, can you discuss who under the old, which I guess is the current search policy within CPD, would have reviewed an application for a search warrant? And also, can you take us through the steps of the Anjanette Young matter and how these changes would have prevented that from happening?
Let me make sure that I understand your question. Under the current policy that was updated in January 2020, a lieutenant is responsible for approving a search warrant. With the changes today, that moves up 3 ranks to a deputy chief. So that's a significant change. Regarding the circumstances of February of 2019, a sergeant could have approved the search warrant. There was no definition of wrong raid at that time. There was no mandatory requirement that when there was a wrong raid, an investigation had to be opened. So where the department was in February of 2019 at the time of the incident at Ms. Young's house is a world away from where we are now. But again, as the superintendent has said, we're certainly not resting on our laurels. We're going to look at the feedback that we get from members of the public and take that into account. The policy changes that are announced today, as the superintendent said, were as a result of engaging with members of the public and focus groups. But obviously, every time we open up something for questions and comments, there's a learning that happens, and we look forward to hearing from members of the public about this new policy. I think that's answered your question.
Yeah, that's
okay. Go
Mayor,
ahead, Craig.
a lot of times police are going in to get bad people on search warrants, and wrong raids, of course, do happen. Do you have any concerns that this could make officers hesitant when they're going in and in any way endanger the officers?
So the real question you're asking is if treating someone with respect gets in the way of doing our job. And the answer is no. So following these policies and procedures with an emphasis on everyone deserves a measure of respect actually enhances our ability to do our job and creates an environment of trust in the community, which again is a force multiplying our being effective at reducing crime.
But is there, what if they're going in and they've got guys who have guns?
So if Ms. Young was the biggest drug kingpin, we still should have treated her with dignity and respect. That should be clear to everyone that her dignity and respect had nothing to do with whether or not she was actually the focus of this or this was a mistake and it was the wrong house. She still deserved a measure of respect. And that does not get in the way of us doing our job, without question.
Question for the mayor.
You know, if I
Sure,
before you ask your question, I just want to add to that. Look, you know, when I was a prosecutor, I prosecuted a lot of drug cases. And not surprising, a lot of drug cases involved the execution of search warrants. And to the point that the superintendent made, the changes that are being instituted before, during, and after the execution of a raid are intended to strengthen the integrity of the process, making sure that there is actual diligence being done and that there is a high-ranking supervisor who's accountable to make sure that that diligence is done beforehand actually strengthens the process and provides legitimacy when search warrants are actually executed. So there should be no officer who is hesitant that his or her work is being subjected to scrutiny by a supervisor. If that is the case, then it's probably a search warrant that never should be executed in the first instance. Go ahead, Dave.
Mayor, I can't speak for everybody in the room, but I can tell you from CBS perspective, it took us 2.5 years to get here. I have a lot of questions, so have a little patience, please. There's a lot of things I don't see here, and I have questions about them. One,
So let's get to them.
There's nothing about, you talk about no knocks. Time after time, police knock and bust. They don't even, it's not a no knock, but they just go in. They don't give anybody time to get to the door. And case after case, it says already in policy that a search warrant has to be turned over promptly. These people didn't get the warrant 2 hours later.
Well, that shouldn't be happening. And now, because there's a requirement that everything related to a search warrant, a body-worn camera has to be present and activated. When we see that happening, that's going to be a problem, not only for those officers, but we will make sure that that is corrected on a systemic basis. So you're right. Anjanette Young's, the search warrant at her house was in February of 2019, before I was mayor, before the superintendent was even in Chicago. But what I can control is what happens now and going forward. And I have made my commitment to the public, not just today, but previously, that we are going to get this right, and we're going to make sure that people's rights are respected. A Fourth Amendment intrusion into someone's house is an exception under the U.S. Constitution, an exception that we have to take seriously. And that's exactly what we are doing in announcing these policy changes today. And if officers don't get it right, that's going to be visible now for all to see, because it's going to be captured on body cameras, and we're going to take decisive action to make sure that those kind of problems simply do not repeat themselves. Transparency is one of the strongest tools that we have to make sure that officers are conducting these search warrants in a way that is consistent with common sense, the Constitution, Illinois state law, Chicago municipal code, and basic precepts of human dignity and respect.
We've already exposed 2 raids that occurred under your watch, February of 2020, after the new policy, the last new policy in January of 2020, where the body cameras were not activated, or the guys wearing them didn't show up until after the raid, based on confidential informants that no one even knew the name of.
So when something like that happens, then there's going to be accountability, Dave. That's why we have policies, and we hold people accountable to those policies.
Nobody's been disciplined yet for any of these raids.
I believe, I don't know the specifics, but if that has been brought to our attention, they're under investigation. Obviously, the investigations need to be done in a timely fashion. And I said at the outset, in response to the first question, I don't have any patience for people dragging their feet on investigations that need to get done. The Inspector General went out publicly in your publication and said in July of 19 that he was doing a top-to-bottom evaluation of wrong raids. In July of 19, we haven't heard a peep from the Inspector General on this issue. Where's he been? Same thing regarding COPA. Opened up an investigation in November of 19, and as far as I can tell, did nothing for over a year until the video of Anjanette Young burst into the scene. I'm about holding people accountable, and we've got to do better, and we've got to get this done.
Question for
Give you one more, and
Superintendent
then we'll
Brown.
go to the rest of the room.
One more for Brown. Superintendent Brown, these are drastic changes with Deputy Superintendent. It's way up there to have him sign off. We know how it was happening before. Since you've been here, since February, since COVID started in March, how many, do you know how many raids you've done?
So I didn't start in February. I started in April.
Okay, April. So since you've been in office, since you've been in your position, do you know how many raids have been conducted?
We average about 1,500 search warrants a year.
Are you still keeping the same average that you had been on pace for in years past?
We have.
So who's conducting those raids?
So again, we had changes in January, and we are implementing these changes with community feedback for additional changes. We start looking at these in December of 2020. We want to move fast with these changes, but we don't want to leave the community behind. So I get your sense of urgency. We have a greater sense of urgency, but it includes working with the community. And so even though that in some perspectives may slow the process of getting changes done, I think it's important to include the community regardless of the time that it takes to get the policies with feedback from the community. So yes, we are on the same pace, or we were on the same pace. Likely what will happen with this higher level of review, that the pace of search warrants will slow, and that we would vet out those search warrants that don't need to be approved. Having it at a level of sergeant to approve across the 22 districts, you likely would have never received standardization or quality in your search warrants. So this is an important step, and I just, again, want to acknowledge the hard work that went into really thinking about how do we make sure we vet through the search warrants that don't need to be served, and make sure that we utilize this enforcement capacity to have the best results, but with the community.
You've taken the police officers off the street. One last question, and I'm done.
You did like one last questions.
Well, you only
Are
asked
you
one, though,
Baptist?
so this is my second one for you.
That's not preacher's clothes that I'm a Baptist, so go ahead, man. One last one. This is the real last one.
I wish I didn't have to be here. So, on a subject like this.
There's a joke there somewhere.
I know it is, but I'm going to let you go. Keep going, man.
You've taken the officers off the street in the Anjanette Young case. They've been stripped of their powers. But none of the officers in any other of these wrong raids we've been reporting on, the Mendez raid, Tate family raid, which were clear-cut wrong raids. They've even admitted to it on their own body cameras that they're in the wrong place. None of these officers have been disciplined. None of these officers have been taken off the street.
So,
some of them are on your community safety team right now.
So right now we're looking at any and all complaints that were presented to us. If some had been presented, I would encourage those that have complaints about search warrants that you've covered to come forward so that we can open up investigations and take the appropriate accountability actions. If you have something, you can do it on their behalf, and we'll look at and reach out to those victims of this and make sure we conduct an investigation. So we're going to move on to somebody else. You got your question asked and answered. Thanks.
Superintendent, was wondering.
Who's your question to?
Who's the question for?
You.
Okay, thanks.
And
There's
could you identify yourself, sir?
Sure, I'm Aaron Gettinger with the Hyde Park Herald. There's an ordinance being put out by the members of the Progressive Reform Caucus to ban no-knock warrants in the city of Chicago, period. I was wondering if you could explain from your perspective and the perspective of the department what the utility is of no-knock warrants in action, even if the restrictions that are being put forward today go into effect. Why the police need this tool in their wheelhouse to do their jobs effectively. Yeah.
We're sworn to protect life. So if the circumstances present themselves that we have to make a quick entry to save someone's life, say someone's being murdered, and we hear the cries and screams, we can't wait outside that door and wait for that offender to kill someone, hearing those loud screams from inside a house. That's just common sense. So again, that one exception, which would be rare, it would be a rare circumstance that we would serve a no-knock warrant. And it requires the level of approval to be a bureau chief, which is the highest ranks of the department.
Okay. Alderman Taliaferro, again about that ordinance that the Progressive Reform Caucus members have filed, would you allow it to be up for a hearing in your committee at this point?
I just received it at the introduction of, it was introduced at the last city council. We are certainly looking at it, and we'll discuss that with the chief sponsors of that.
Have you had any discussions so far?
Not yet. I just received it.
Understood. And
Thank you.
The mayor, in that ordinance, it made a specific mention of gender identity as far as officers searching.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Gender identity as opposed to gender with officers searching suspects during no-knock warrants and that kind of thing. And your today mentioned gender officers of the same gender searching members or targets of no-knock raids and that kind of thing. I just wondered if there are any protections as far as for trans individuals with the policy that you've laid out today. If you could discuss, any more policy for
Well,
protections
again,
for trans Chicagoans.
When you see the actual verbiage of the search warrant, it's very clear that no matter who the person is, that they have to be treated with dignity and respect. That's the first line of the substance of the policy. So obviously that would cover anyone, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their gender status.
All right, we're going to
Thank
do
you.
2 more from Doug.
All right, two off topics, Mayor.
Okay.
One is from the Better Government Association. They say your Monuments Commission has recommended that 41 statues be considered for removal. The BGA is reporting that the committee you appointed to consider the matter met without public notice or access and opened its first meeting by stating, "Whatever is said here stays here." Do you condone statements such as that by committees that are meeting to consider matters of significant public interest?
I know that that's what the BGA is reporting. I have no confirmation whatsoever that that's what's said. And I think what we should focus on is what the committee is doing, which is to raise a important discussion and focus public comment and concern around monuments, memorials, and other historic markers across our city that have raised concern in light of kind of today's view of those issues. I think that they put together, and if you look at the people that are on the committee, it's a lot of very thoughtful folks that both are artists themselves, come from the art history world, but also kind of everyday citizens who are weighing in on, I think, an issue of great importance. And I look forward to seeing the conclusion of their work. They put the 41 items out for public comment and review. And we've gotten, I think, a lot of very helpful feedback, and we'll continue on.
And then from Kelly Bauer at Block Club, she says, the question is that you've spoken about what you don't like in the Martwick elected school board bill. You've talked about wanting parent representation on an elected school board, but you haven't offered your own plan. Do you no longer support an elected school board?
Well, I think what I've been very clear about now for probably 2+ years is a set of values under which we have to organize. It's obviously important that we make sure that parents are heard. I think this last episode that we went through with CTU only underscored that. Myself, Dr. Jackson, and other CPS executives heard over and over again from parents and members of the public that they felt like they were not being heard. And we can't move forward with any kind of new governance structure that doesn't genuinely provide a pathway for parents to have a seat at the table. One of the other things that doesn't, I think, get enough consideration when it comes to the Martwick bill is it doesn't allow for people who are undocumented in our city to have a seat at the table. We have a substantial portion of CPS students and parents who are themselves undocumented, and to basically exclude them from having kind of any voice on a new form of governance for the Chicago Public Schools doesn't make any sense to me. So there are a number of fundamental problems with that Martwick bill. We are in the process now of listening to a lot of different stakeholders across the city to engage them in a conversation about what governance should look like based upon people in Chicago who have a vested interest in making sure that our students are front and center at in these discussions. This discussion has been about power and dynamics, but not been about our kids. And we've got to reorient that discussion to really focus on them and making sure that the people who are most protective of our children, meaning their parents and guardians, actually have a seat at the table. And the Martwick proposal, and frankly none other than I've seen, actually makes sure that that happens. What we don't want is what we've seen from other locations across the country, for example, in California, where a single school board race was $1 million race. That excluded lots of voices, and it will exclude if that's the kind of model and dynamic that is set up here. So we've got to be very thoughtful and careful about what form of governance that we push forward. And we've got to, as I said, and I've been very clear on this, parents have to have a genuine pathway to sit on that school board.
All right, thank you, Mayor. Thank you.
Superintendent about the carjacking.
One more to the suit
we-
on carjacking. That's it.
Okay.
Superintendent, so we saw that the carjackings were down last month, according to your numbers, and we saw the department talked about the weather may have played a factor, but the shootings remain steady. So what in your mind made a difference in terms of getting those numbers down, and what do you want the public to know about carjackings?
I think first and foremost, let me talk in broad terms about the criminal justice systems and the global pandemic's impact on the criminal justice systems. So the courts have been closed to jury trials for 11 months, almost a year now. So there's been no rendering of justice. And so the levers of justice are effective when officers make an arrest, people are brought to court and have a fair trial, and some are convicted and brought to justice. That sends the message to criminals that this type of behavior won't be tolerated. So to not have that for 11 months, and the cops are not judge, juror, or jailer. We make an arrest, and we have made, as of this morning, 340 arrests for carjackings, which include vehicular hijackings, possession of stolen cars, the felony charge of stealing a car. I mean, we've taken down some of these crews, which have had the more immediate impact, but the longer term impact will be much more effective when our courts open back up. We are encouraged to hear that there are some discussions about opening the courts in March, sometime this month, but the full pressures of the criminal justice systems on criminal behavior won't be seen until the courts are fully opened. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.